Catcher in the Rye is a subversive look at the trauma of growing up in a post-war society. Any story that attempts to comprehensively investigate this subject must include the topic of education, which is the largest of all time commitments for children of Holden's age. Being a book about the 3 days between expulsion from a boarding school and confessing this failure to parents, Holden's story is as much about education as it is about anything else. Holden has 2 conversations with teachers in The Catcher in the Rye, and by analyzing these 2 conversations, we can understand how Holden interacts with and interprets schooling in his depressive state. Let's run through some bullet points first to notice just how parallel these 2 scenes are. The first teacher-student conversation occurs in Chapter 2 with Mr. Spencer. The second occurs in Chapter 24 with Mr. Antolini. Holden feels like he's disappearing while going to Mr. Spencer's and after he leaves Mr. Antolini's. Both teachers answer the door in a bathrobe. Both teachers impress upon Holden that he's headed for a downfall. Mr. Spencer reads Holden his particularly bad essay on the Egyptians, and Holden nearly recites these words to some kids after leaving Mr. Antolini's. Holden emphasizes his success in English class during both conversations. Lastly, Holden leaves both Mr. Spencer's and Mr. Antolini's houses abruptly and with a phony excuse. The parallelism in these scenes is astounding, as they seem to deliberately match each other in structure. However, there are a few differences worth noting by examining Holden's conversation with Mr. Antolini. Mr. Antolini stands out as the only person to go near James Castle's body after Castle jumped from a dorm room window. The image of Antolini covering Castle's body with his coat and carrying Castle to the infirmary powerfully demonstrates his impact on Holden. Perhaps Holden, who expresses some suicidal thoughts, hopes that Mr. Antolini can help him navigate this dicey transition. Mr. Antolini is able to get a much more authentic conversation out of Holden than Mr. Spencer. The reason that Mr. Antolini is able to reach Holden is that Mr. Antolini is relatable. He smokes with Holden and is noticeably drunk during their conversation. Moreover, he appeals to Holden's intellect and speaks to Holden's potential. By zeroing in on Holden's failure in oral expression class, Antolini brings Holden's struggles with both vulnerability and ADD to light. Holden can't stick to the point in the class speeches, garnering deductions for digressions. Despite his compassionate approach, Mr. Antolini's picture of Holden's potential downfall is darker than Mr. Spencer's. He says things like, "I can very clearly see you dying nobly, one way or another, for some highly unworthy cause." So the fact that Holden is receptive to Mr. Antolini's biting remonstrations shows his growth over the novel. The carousel of events, symbolizing recurring patterns in mundane daily life, swings full circle, and Holden unknowingly confronts a major problem with authority. While he remains in anguish, he need only recognize these gains to adopt a hopeful perspective on his life direction. Antolini's monologue is the only meaningful tirade directed at Holden in the novel, all other conversations happening in fragmented and distracted exchanges. Holden really tunes in for the first time and encounters some extraordinary truth. This stands in stark contrast to Holden's wandering mind focusing on the ducks of Central Park while talking with Mr. Spencer. After giving his advice, Mr. Antolini makes Holden a bed on his couch. Sadly, Holden wakes in the middle of the night to a drunk Mr. Antolini stroking his head, and he leaves unexpectedly. Whether or not Mr. Antolini was actually making a pass at Holden remains unclear, but in my understanding, it fits the narrative of the novel that Holden misinterpreted the situation and capitalized on the opportunity to distance himself once again. He has trouble getting close physically or emotionally with any character in the book, and it is no surprise that as an oversexed teenager, he would place a sexual motivation where there isn't any. However, one could interpret the act as sexual molestation, and note Salinger's point about how difficult it is to accept truth when it comes from people just as disturbed as ourselves. Salinger never clarifies, and the power in this passage is in its ambiguity. You take from this event what you will, just as we in our unique perspectives craft meaning out of latent environment. Holden then sleeps in Grand Central Station, achingly depressed. He even feels like he's disappearing once again while crossing the street. This is an odd observation that accompanies his leaving Pensieve, and is connected to the physical sickness into which he descends. Psychologically, Holden fears that he has destroyed any hope for a meaningful life, and like the ducks, his only option is to disappear from friends and family and start over in anonymity. When this disappearing happens in Chapter 25, Holden prays to Allie to help him safely cross the road. This is an attempt to find meaning and protection even though Holden doesn't believe in God. Despite leaving Antolini's apartment disturbed, Holden applies Antolini's words at the Museum of Natural History where he meets Phoebe. He chooses to teach two kids his limited knowledge about the Egyptians. Amidst this interaction, Holden sees profane graffiti on invaluable art. This angers Holden, and if we look deeper, it depicts a likely path if Holden chooses to ignore Mr. Antolini's words. Antolini outlined the importance of education to express oneself more clearly and follow one's thoughts through to the end. If Holden continues his embittered and isolated downfall, he would end up being the type of person who has no constructive thought to offer in conversation, and instead can only muster graffiti-like taglines even in the most sacred of circumstances. The same decision to heed Mr. Antolini's advice keeps Holden from running to Colorado, as that plan embodies the type of person who Antolini describes gave up looking before he ever even really got started. However, Antolini's advice can only go so far, and it is Phoebe, and the prospect of a deep emotional relationship with her, which eventually impresses upon Holden a sense of responsibility. Over the next few videos, we'll look at symbols in The Catcher in the Rye and see how some of the best TV shows around use them to reference this book.
It's called the carousel.